So our next speaker is also a participant in this year's field school. Etienne Damme is a undergraduate student from the University of Augsburg, and the University of Augsburg, from which Uwe Vogt hails, has been involved with Fane from the beginning. They should almost be made an honorary patron of Fane. Even before Fane existed, I was talking about Fane to Uwe and his colleagues at Augsburg, and Uwe was a participant in the very first meeting in 2015 and would have been here if he could. And so Etienne Damme studies with Uwe, and we met this year in Mitwitz at a conference on water. Uwe had heard about, and I should also say Joachim Rathmann, one of the four directors of Fane, is also at the University of Augsburg. So we have an Augsburg connection. And from Joachim Rathmann, Etienne heard about the field school and asked me very briefly if it was possible to join. And I said, sure, drop me an email. And lo and behold, it all came to pass. And he's been here with us for a week, for a fascinating week of surviving a lot of things and enjoying ourselves at the same time. So Etienne is a very serious philosophy student. I know that because whenever he's not helping out, which he's doing quite often, he's got a philosophy book in his hand. So he's working very hard on many things. I know it includes Erkenntnistheorie because that's one of the books I saw, Theory of Knowledge and Cassira. So we're going to find more about Etienne's world of research interests right now. So Etienne, I give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much also for having me here. I hope the presentation is working.
Yeah, it's working just fine.
Sorry.
Okay. Perfect.
All right. So, yeah, a book written by Joachim Rathmann, Marion Friedrich, and Uwe Vogt was recently published with the title Ego or Echo, Narcissism and the Ecological Crisis. In it, the current environmental crisis and an increasingly narcissistic society are viewed as two phenomena that are so closely related that it raises the question of whether they are not two sides of the same coin. Is the political and social crisis just a reflection of the ecological crisis that will soon affect all of us on a global scale? Without placing too much of a burden of proof on myself, I think it's probably safe to say that the cause of these problems, or rather this only one problem, lies in a disturbed relationship between humans and the environment. This relationship has always been central to the political stability of a society. Using now a relevant historical parallel, namely the decline of the Diadochi empires, I would like to show how political crisis can arise as a result of a disturbed relationship with nature. In particular, I would like to emphasize 4 points. First of all, that, as I mentioned, the Stoic philosopher Posidonius also attributed the causes of the political crisis of his time to nature and a disturbed relationship with it. Second, that this relationship is essentially disturbed because it is an affective relationship, and this is where the Stoic character of this approach becomes apparent. Third, I would like to show that this affective relationship between humans and nature can essentially be interpreted as an egoistic and narcissistic relationship. And last but not least, I would like to show that this egocentricity was evident both towards nature and towards society. So let's get to know the historical background of what I would like to show you. A little over 2,000 years ago, people in the Mediterranean region were facing an existential political crisis. The Diadochi empires, into which Alexander the Great's empire split after his death 323 BC, they all became scenes of political decline. For example, the Seleucid Empire, which once stretched from the Levant to India. You can see this in the purple color here. It was conquered by neighboring people and suffered great territorial losses. This is a map of 300 BC, 200 BC, and finally 100 BC. Also, in 133 BC, the once so powerful Attalid Empire, here in red, resignated, fell to the Romans, as you can see in this map, due to the resignation of its ruler. And also the Ptolemaic Empire here in yellow, today's Egypt, also suffered from internal political intrigues and scandals. And interestingly, as I mentioned, the parallel to this decline of all these Hellenistic empires, the emerging Roman Empire seemed confidently able to resist this trend of decline. So the question is now, how did it come about that these once so powerful Diadochi empires faced political deaths while Rome was able to become the dominant power in the Mediterranean region at the same time? And the Stoic philosopher Posidonius of Apamea asked himself this central question, and I would like to examine Posidonius' answer to it. A little about his vita, because Posidonius is not so famous as Schelling in this room. Posidonius lived from 135 to 53 BC. The city of Apamea, where he grew up, is located in the middle of the Seleucid Empire and was politically a very important city. His early disappointment with his homeland was probably the reason why he left for Athens around 110 BC to study, of course, philosophy. And it was deliberately so a farewell to his homeland with no intention of returning. He then went to the school of Panaetius of Rhodes, a famous Stoic philosopher. In the early 90s, he set off to an extensive research trip and visited Rome, Gaul, Spain, and probably also Egypt and Asia Minor. In the mid-90s, he settled in his new adopted home of Rhodes, probably inspired by his teacher Panaetius, married a local woman, and probably had a family there. He then founded a famous school of philosophy in Rhodes, which later was continued by his grandson. And it can be assumed that at this time he was very close to the Roman elite, having visited Rome several times, and Rhodes was also a popular stopover for Roman political officials. So Posidonius wrote an historical work, creative as he was, the Histories, which he began in 86 and never really completed. What makes his work so special is that he was less interested in writing just an history of events rather than providing ethnographic descriptions of various people around the Mediterranean region, such as the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Romans, the Celts, the Gauls, probably all the stations he visited earlier. The reason for this is that he wanted to use these descriptions to find out how all these empires around the Mediterranean lost their power. He's concerned with the reasons for the decline of the people, and that's why he's also referred to as a historian of decline, precisely because he's interested in the decline of these dynasties. Posidonius was the first philosopher who wrote history, and of course, his work can easily be read just as a chronicle of events. And I think there is no problem with doing so. However, we here are interested in a philosophical interpretation of his text. And at that point, we must include a brief digression to the Stoic theory of emotions. So, starting from a causally determined nature, Stoicism advocates the idea of an all-pervading reason, the pneuma, which predetermines the world as it is and as it will be. In a completely determined system, of course, the question arises of free will and ethical responsibility. For the Stoics, however, and this is quite an answer to these questions, external stimuli of the world are not sufficient to determine our actions. So in terms of action theory, humans are preformed but not determined. For Stoic ethics, the question arises instead of what an appropriate response to these external stimuli should look like. And according to the Stoics, this is the responsibility of the logos, or the individual reason. Logos should guide our actions. When the reason is well developed, Stoics believe that this coincides with virtue, and conversely, affective reactions are bad because they are ill-considered reactions. Affects such as greed, anger, excessive joy are clearly anti-ideals. They are signs of kakia, of moral badness. Stoics describe the ideal of an absolute peace of mind, of freedom from all effects, as ataraxia. And according to the ancient Stoicism, affects arise when people make intellectual misjudgments about their actions. Affects are really just an unfortunate byproduct caused by a malfunction of the intellect. Unlike in Plato's philosophy, affects are not separate parts of the soul, but simply arise from transgressions, from partial lack of reason. They originate in a lack of rationality and then manifest themselves as unfortunate transgressions when people are unable to react rationally. Posidonius essentially follows the Stoic theory of affects. He also sees the world as completely determined, with only human reason capable of responding appropriately to these external stimuli. He also considers affect-driven actions to be reprehensible and morally wrong. However, he completely contradicts the ancient Stoicism when it comes to the structure of the soul. The ancient Stoics, as I said, emphasized the unity of the soul, which is why affects arise from a rational soul when it's not adequately developed. For Posidonius, affects no longer arise from a failure of rationality. No, he prefers to return to Plato's classical model of soul. As in Plato, emotions now originate in the lower two parts of the soul, the thymoides and the epigenetikon. And what's quite interesting is that he actually uses these Platonic terms. They are no longer substitute, also the emotions are no longer substitute action of reason, but active forces, excessive drives that can overwhelm reason. This gives rise to the demand that the logistikon should suppress the lower two parts of the soul and fight against them. For Posidonius, a poor mental state stems from the domination of the irrational parts of the soul over the rational ones. And now the decisive factor is this. Posidonius sees the decline of the people being caused by the irrational affects determining human actions and gaining the upper hand. Empires collapse when the active forces of the emotional parts of the soul rule over the rational reason of the logistikon, even though it should actually be the other way around. And this position now has a decisive advantage over the old Stoicism, which could not actually explain how affects could arise from the insufficiently developed reason. And Posidonius' new draft now makes this possible by granting affects a certain degree of independence. And the goal in Posidonius' histories is now to find the causes of these affects in history. What causes the irrational parts of the soul to suddenly become so strongly evoked in the human psyche, where the logistikon should actually determine our actions and bring them into harmony with the world logos? The goal of the histories, with its unconventional descriptions of countries, is if we prefer the philosophical interpretation, to show why and what ethnological, geographical, and political influences of the past and the present have led to emotions suddenly ruling human actions instead of rationality. And this should explain why certain empires were able to fall. So for Posidonius, history is a psychological, affective research into causes. Now here's the point. Posidonius sees the causes, as I said, in ethnographical, but as I want to emphasize, especially in geographical and climatic conditions of a country. It is these conditions that evoke affects in a person, which in turn, as irrational parts of the soul, cause the decline of diadochi empires. So the relationship with the environment that Posidonius describes here is essentially guided by emotions. Posidonius probably had access to many classics of literature in Apamea, or probably in Athens, because this idea is not particularly new. The famous physician and natural philosopher Hippocrates, the latter is often overlooked, advocated a doctrine that today is known as environmental determinism. He established a connection between human well-being and the environment. Health or illness depend on the human habitat. And I want to plead for a similar interpretation of Posidonius' historical work. I think Posidonius wants to prove that the political situation of a state, as Hippocrates tells us, is influenced by the location of the place, the nature of the soil, the climate, and the winds. Posidonius now expands this Hippocratical approach to include the Stoic doctrine of affects in a kind of Platonic disguise. Nature does not act directly on humans, but through the medium of emotions, which have their origin in environmental factors. Humans therefore relate to nature primarily on an affective level, and nature has also a certain offer to be understood effectively. According to the Platonic model of soul, there is a close connection between the lower two parts of the soul, the thymoedes and the epitymeticon, and nature. Both relate to each other epistemically, and for Posidonius, the problem lies precisely in an excess of affects, which should not determine our actions. Sorry. So, according to my interpretation of Posidonius, humans' disturbed relationship with nature leads to affective actions. These are blamed for the political chaos of his time. Certain conditions and circumstances in nature encourage and provoke people's emotions. They create an imbalance that causes the emotional parts of the soul to dominate over reason. With its riches and challenges, nature becomes a temptation that can lead people astray and cause them to develop a disturbed relationship with nature and makes emotional decisions. The inner struggle between reason and passion, fueled by the environment, leads to political chaos. Posidonius emphasizes that this can awaken selfish desires in particular. And there are several examples in his text which I want to show you now. I think I didn't mention it, so do it now. The work itself is fragmentary and can only be reconstructed through the quotations and excerpts from other authors, especially Diodor and Athenaeus. So here's an example. The ruler of Egypt was hated by the masses, but was flattered by his entourage. He lived in a great debauchery and was no longer even able to work unless he was supported by two companions. But for the dances during the feasts, he jumped barefoot from his raised couches and performed them more lively than those who were skilled in them. On another one. Scipio Africanus and his fellow envoys arrived in Alexandria to inspect the entire kingdom. Ptolemy, the king of the Ptolemaic Empire, received them with a large entourage and great pomp, held lavish banquets, and showed them all the rest of his wealth during a tour of the palace. The Roman envoys, who were distinguished by their virtue, ate only a little and only healthy food, and they despised the extravagance that would have ruined their souls and bodies. And then they sailed up to the Nile to Memphis and studied the advantages of a country and the prosperity brought by Nile. The multitude of the cities in Egypt and countless inhabitants, and all the advantages of the country, namely that it is favorably situated for the secure exercise of power and the formation of a great empire. And when they had marveled at the multitude of the inhabitants of Egypt and the advantages of its geographically position, they realized that a very great empire could be established here if the kingdom fell into the hands of worthy rulers. It's interesting to note that the selfishness described in these examples can be found in countless other places in the histories. It is often those in power who are sharply criticized by Posidonius for their excessive feasting, their extravagance, and intemperance. The contrast between the decadent King Ptolemy Physcon and the virtuous Romans, who do not allow themselves to be seduced by the wealth of the country, shows that things not only should be different, as Adorno would say, but actually can be different. Due to a variety of reasons which cannot be addressed here now, the criticism of the elite was a locus classicus of Stoic ethics. With Posidonius, the Stoic criticism of elite, similar to Cicero's criticism of the Roman elite, seems to have gone beyond just the purpose of simple moral sermon. He's no longer concerned with the criticism of those in power, of those at top, but with finding the causes of the actual decline of entire empires. Another example, Posidonius the Stoic also writes the following in his third book of the Histories. Just as I said, it's all quotation and excerpts from other authors. In Arabia and Syria, the Persea and the so-called pistachio also grow, which bear a grape-shaped fruit, white-skinned and long, similar to tears. These sit one above the other like grapes. Inside, they are greenish and also inferior to pine nuts in taste, have a more pleasant aroma. Unremarkable passages such as this are very common in Posidonius. According to him, the selfish behavior of rulers arose just from geographical causes like this. The pistachio becomes, also in my interpretation, a pars pro toto, a symbol of the selfish upper class that exploits nature, enriches itself from it, and enjoys its luxury goods. An upper class that's driven by hedonism and greed simply because they can. It is this behavior that provokes the decline of the Diadochi empires. However, the emotional depravity of the rulers was not only evident to their all-ofness and decadence towards their own people, who were not particularly enthusiastic, but on the contrary, also reacted emotionally to the selfish actions of the rulers. Now, we know from other sources that the form of government in Hellenism, the monarchy, led to enormous environmental pollution. In comparison, the polis of the classical period had little ecological impact. Polis were communities of 700 to a few thousand inhabitants who depended on the preservation of their surrounding countryside. The royal courts of the Hellenistic monarchs, on the other hand, became a real burden on people and the environment. Not only the construction of the palaces, but also their maintenance cost the surrounding area many valuable resources. This destruction of the immediate environment certainly took place, but at the same time, it did not yet assume the global dimensions we see today. And to be fair, Posidonius is not really interested in the egocentricity towards nature, but more of this political dimension. So let's summarize this briefly. Posidonius experiences the political demise of his homeland and most of the neighboring empires. The reason for this is clear to him. Certain emotions prevail in humans and dominate the rational part of the soul, which is no longer capable of making good decisions. This is what I call the Stoic part of this presentation. In his search for the causes of these negative effects, he comes to the conclusion that certain geographical and natural conditions strongly favor affective behavior. In my interpretation of the histories, nature invites exploitation and thus favors emotional and, in particular, selfish affective behavior. This is what I call the Hippocratic, natural, deterministic part of his teaching. This selfish behavior manifests itself both towards society in form of the neglect of society and in selfishness towards nature, which is systematically exploited more and more. One point, however, is important to mention. We should not jump to the conclusion that Posidonius considered any emotional relationship with nature to be inherently bad. What the Stoics have generally understood as pathos or affect since Chrysipp are false emotions that lead to misjudgments in decisions. These are sharply distinguished from the oipaiteia, from the good feelings, which are in accordance with reason. The Stoics make a clear distinction here. The Stoics' ideal of apatheia or affectlessness does not aim at an emotionally cold, indifferent person who at all costs can only relate to nature and can only engage with it rationally. No, it only aims at the wrong emotions. In my opinion, Posidonius can be understood to mean that our relationship is always shaped by feelings and could be seen, for example, in the Roman embassy, who virtuously admired the rich country while despising its exploitative extravagance. What is crucial, however, is that this emotional relationship with nature must not degenerate into an affective relationship, as in the case of the immobile Ptolemaic king. But it must always be guided by reason and aim at virtues in our dealings with nature in order to moderate us and keep us in check. Posidonius presents us a typically ancient view of the relationship between humans and environment, one that is surprisingly relevant for today. On the one hand, humans rise above nature, create their own artificial world and step out of nature. And on the other hand, we are overwhelmed by our own nature. Our emotions become the unpredictable factors of an inner crisis, and our reason is forced to give way. The word crisis describes, in a very Stoic sense, the inner conflict with our own emotional nature with which we are confronted. And at the same time, however, the inner crisis also points to an outer crisis that affects our political bubble, but also nature and our environment. The domination of affects over reason ultimately leads to very concrete political consequences, including the collapse of the entire system, both the political and, in the long term, also the ecological. Thank you.
Thank you, Etienne. We have questions.
We are over time, so a couple of questions.
We're kind of over time, yeah. We are?
Yeah.
Isn't the reception at 5:15? It doesn't matter. We have a couple questions. Quick questions, quick answers. Sure.
Thanks, Etienne. That was great. I think you made an important distinction about the stance on emotions towards the conclusion, but I'm going to ask my question anyway because I feel like there's still something there. So you spoke of how the irrational affected state of being as a significant reason for the decline of ancient empires.
Mhm.
So as I guess it seems like here we're having this kind of discussion around like smaller ecologically minded communities and like relocalizing versus outsourcing and rewilding, like these kind of things. So I guess in that, like, would it seem like we would do well to encourage the affective emotional being, since it has an effect on dismantling larger systems?
So, as I mentioned in the last part of the presentation, I think what is very important is the distinction between good emotions and affects on the other side. You can call them what you want. And the good emotions always point towards virtues, always point towards, yeah, a kind of rationally, kind of a value or a virtue. And I think this is important, that emotions have like also, yeah, point at a virtue, point at something, and not just effects that you cannot control and that are just exploiting nature. But yeah, I agree. We should not read Posidonios as an author that just hates emotions at all. I think what is really the point here is the distinction that he neglects the wrong emotions, the affects, but not the good emotions, not the ones that lead towards virtue.
Etienne, thank you. I'm going to pester you at dinner with many questions.